broadcast is now starting. All attendees are in listen-only mode.
Hi, welcome everyone. Thank you for joining today's webinar. We're going to go ahead and get started. Today's webinar will walk you through what WRI's research has to say about the climate impacts of beef. It's a topic that's been in the press a lot lately, and of course here with Memorial Day in the United States about to come up, I know a lot of us are also thinking about our own eating. So we wanted to shed some light on some of the key facts. We will kick off with 2 presentations and then save time at the end to take some of your questions. Just a note that this webinar is being recorded and will be available on WRI's events page afterwards. So without further ado, our speakers today are Janet Ranganathan, who is Vice President for Science and Research at WRI, and Rich Waite, who is one of our lead researchers with the food program at WRI. I will hand it off to Janet.
Thank you very much, Gillian, and thank you all for joining us today on what I think is a critical topic on sustainable development. So for those of you who don't know us, the World Resources Institute is a research-based, mission-driven organization that works at the intersection of environment and human well-being. We focus on 7 global challenges, so food, forests, water, climate, energy, cities, and the ocean. And although we're focusing on food today, I would say that the food will make a critical contribution, either positively or negatively, to those other goals as well. And just being quite frank, we can't address food sustainability by just looking at the production side. We need to look at the consumption side, which is what we're going to focus on today. And food is also a critical sector to address if we are to meet the climate goals of the Paris Agreement. So just a few factoids on the food sector. The first one, agriculture accounts for 1/4 of global greenhouse gas emissions, with about half of those from land use change. And just to follow that up, under a business as usual scenario, the agricultural sector, the food sector, will account for 70% of the economy-wide carbon budget. Also, not just that sector, for the entire economy. So just underscoring my earlier point, we can't actually solve the climate problem without addressing this sector. Just moving along to the next factoid. Agriculture actually occupies nearly half of the vegetated land on the planet. So, and of that, half, 2/3 are used for pasture for cows and other ruminants, so goats and sheep. Beef requires 20 times more land and emits 20 times more greenhouse gases per gram of edible protein than sort of common plant-based proteins, such as beans, peas, and lentils. And the global consumption of ruminant meat, beef, lamb, and goat, is projected to rise 88% between 2010 and 2050. So although beef consumption has fallen by about 1/3 per person since the 70s here, overall globally it's still on the rise. And then just one last factoid I thought I'd share with you. The average American male consumes nearly twice the amount of protein he needs to meet his dietary requirements. So with that, I'm going to pass. One thing that I should mention is a lot of what you're hearing today, and indeed those facts that I've just shared with you, came from a report that we put out. The synthesis is out already, Creating a Sustainable Food Future. Watch out for the full report, which we're going to launch in July, but I would definitely recommend that as essential reading. So thank you for that. Over to you, Rich.
Great. Well, thanks, Jillian. Thanks, Janet. And thanks, everyone who's joined the webinar today. So I'm going to spend the next 20 minutes or so going through 6 big questions about beef and climate change, kind of give our take on that. So let's start with the basics. First question, how does beef production cause greenhouse gas emissions? And Janet alluded to the fact that there's these kind of 2 buckets of emissions. Emissions are caused through the agricultural production process and then also through land use change. So when we talk about emissions from beef, agricultural production tends to be what most people think of. So if you've been following the news lately, you might think it's all about cows farting methane. So just to dispel this myth right off the bat, the methane actually comes from the cow burps. 95% of that methane actually comes out of the front end of the cow. So methane, though, it's a potent greenhouse gas, and it's a greenhouse gas that cows and other ruminants like goats and sheep emit as they digest grasses and plants. And this process is called enteric fermentation. Methane is also emitted from manure, and then nitrous oxide, which is another powerful greenhouse gas, is emitted from ruminant waste on pastures, and also from chemical fertilizers that are used on crops that are produced for cattle feed. So more indirectly, but also very importantly, rising beef production requires increasing quantities of land. And so new pasture land is often created by cutting down trees, tropical forest these days, and that releases carbon dioxide that's stored in forests. So when you add it all up, a 2013 study by the UN Food and Agriculture Organization estimated that total annual emissions from animal agriculture, so that's production plus land use change, were about 14.5% of all human emissions. And of those, beef contributed the most, about 41%. So that means beef production is about 6% of total greenhouse gas emissions, putting it roughly on par with total emissions from India, which in turn is the third largest greenhouse gas emitter behind China in the US. So looking to the future, as Janet said, beef-related emissions are projected to grow because beef consumption is projected to grow by so much, more than 80%. And that's going to put a lot of pressure on forests and on biodiversity and on the climate. So when we looked out to the year 2050 and ran some sort of business as usual scenarios, we projected that even as agriculture continues to improve in efficiency year on year, as it has been, pasture land could still expand by roughly 400 million hectares to meet beef demand, and that's an area of land larger than the size of India. So the issue with that is pretty much every climate modeler's pathway to keeping warming below 1.5 or 2 degrees Celsius assumes that we're going to halt deforestation very soon, within the next couple decades, and then also start scaling up reforestation. So going the other direction, having another 400 million hectares of pasture expansion would essentially put the goals of the Paris Agreement on climate change out of reach. Next slide. So question 2, is beef more resource intensive than other foods? And the short answer there is yes, and then also the other ruminants, lamb and goat meat. And so why is this? Ruminant animals have lower growth rates and lower reproduction rates than pigs and poultry, so they require more feed per unit of meat produced. And so animal feed, of course, requires land to grow it. So you can see the pattern to the right. Beef, lamb, and goat down there on the bottom are more resource intensive to produce than other kinds of meat. And animal-based foods overall are more resource intensive than plant-based foods. And as Janet mentioned, if you compare beef to beans and lentils on the graph, beef requires 20 times more land and emits 20 times more greenhouse gases than per gram of edible protein. So you can come back and say, well, but isn't pasture land a free resource? Like, the majority of the world's pastures can't grow crops and can't grow trees. These are the world's native grasslands. They're too dry or too hilly to grow crops or trees. And that's true, but those lands are already heavily used for livestock production. So that means additional beef demand, again, we're looking at the year 2050, is likely to increase pressure on the world's tropical forests. And that's why the high land use of beef is an issue from a climate standpoint. So now we get into the weeds a little bit, but this is important. So the third question is, why are some people saying that beef production is only a small contributor to greenhouse gas emissions? So the short answer is that these estimates commonly leave out the land use piece, such as cutting down forests to establish new pasture land. So there's a lot of statistics out there that account for emissions from beef production, but not from associated land use change. So for example, some people point to, this is US EPA's estimates of greenhouse gas emissions within US borders in 2017. They say, well, look, agriculture is only 9% of total US emissions. Beef production, which is a slice inside agriculture, is something like, it's only 3% of US emissions. Another study came out recently saying, well, what if we completely removed animals from US agriculture? It would reduce US greenhouse gas emissions by only 3%. So it's like, so what's the point of all of this? And the thing that's missing here is all of these estimates, they're accounting for emissions from agricultural production in the US, but they leave out the emissions associated with continuing to devote land to agriculture to produce this food. So land is a limited resource. You can't create more of it. And so if you're considering emissions associated with domestic beef production, you can't just look at it within US borders, because globally beef demand is on the rise. And food is a global commodity, it's traded between countries, and so what's consumed here can drive land use impacts and emissions elsewhere. So, for example, an increase in US beef consumption could result in deforestation, additional deforestation to make way for new pasture land in Latin America. So think about it this way: pasture land area has been pretty constant in the US, even going way back to the 1950s. So what if all of a sudden people in the US decide to eat twice as many burgers as before? Well, we can't grow much more here, so we're going to have to start importing more, and that puts more pressure on tropical forests abroad, where production is expanding. Conversely, think about, well, what if people ate half as many burgers as today? Well, that decrease in US beef consumption could avoid deforestation elsewhere, because imagine beef production goes on as it is today, but as the global markets expand, more beef is exported elsewhere. Overall, compared to business as usual, that puts less pressure on forests abroad, and as countries import more US beef. So when the land use impacts of beef production are accounted for, we found that the greenhouse gas impacts associated with the average US diet actually come close to per capita US energy related emissions, which is kind of a surprising result, which suggests that our dietary choices are similar in consequence for the climate as our energy choices. And so just to, this is from our 2016 Shifting Diets research. This kind of shows what happens when one new person eating the average US diet is added to the world. So it takes about a hectare of land, about 2.5 acres, to produce the food that the average American person eats. And nearly half of that, which is in red, comes from beef production. Now, the emissions from agricultural production are about 1 ton of CO2 per person per year, and usually that's what's counted. But you have to think about what happens when you clear that 1 additional hectare of land to feed that 1 additional person. That would lead to land use change emissions that are up to 15 tons of CO2 per person per year. So now you're in the neighborhood of like 16 tons per person per year for diet-related emissions. Meanwhile, energy-related emissions are in the neighborhood of 18 to 22 tons. So all in all, what we eat, yes, it does matter for the climate. But it's just not what we eat, it's also how we produce it, and that also matters for the climate. So the next question is, can beef be produced more sustainably? And the short answer is absolutely. Although, since cattle are ruminants, they will always be relatively resource intensive to produce, as I said before. So this map is showing the emissions intensity of beef production across the world. So this is kilograms of CO2 equivalent per kilogram of protein produced. And you can see that it varies a lot. In the global north, it's relatively efficient. In the tropics, it's relatively inefficient and varies by like a factor of 30 between regions. So what this means is it's actually a huge opportunity to improve the efficiency of livestock production, especially across the tropics, and that can greatly reduce land use and emissions per pound of meat produced. So, and this can be done through a variety of different things: improving feed quality, improving veterinary care, reducing disease, and then also raising improved cattle breeds that can convert feed into meat and milk more efficiently. And then also improved management practices like rotational grazing. This can boost productivity, it can improve soil health, and it can reduce emissions at the same time. So, and then boosting productivity in turn, since you're getting more meat or milk per hectare, that then takes pressure off tropical forests by reducing the need for more pasture land. And there's a lot of examples of these improved practices. So, for example, in Colombia, some beef production is called silvopasture. It integrates trees, shrubs, and grasses onto pasture lands, and it helps the land produce a higher quantity of feed and also a higher quality of feed. And this enables farmers to put a lot more cows on the same amount of land. So, some farms have been able to quadruple or more the number of cows per acre, while greatly reducing methane emissions per pound of meat because the cows are growing more quickly. There's also other emerging technologies that can further reduce emissions from beef production. So feed additives are being researched that could reduce methane emissions by 30% or more. There's technologies that can help prevent the nitrogen in animal waste on the pastures from turning into nitrous oxide. There's ways to improve manure management. So all told, there's a lot that can be done on the production side to reduce emissions related to beef production, especially in the tropics where meat consumption is projected to grow most quickly. So, taking all of this together, does this mean we all need to stop eating beef to curb climate change? And the answer there is, well, no. But it also means that cutting back in places where we consume a lot of beef, so like in the Americas and Europe, could greatly reduce pressure on forests and the climate. So, I mean, the good news here is reining in climate change doesn't mean everybody needs to become a vegan or vegetarian. Doesn't even mean everybody needs to stop eating beef. And you can look at the graph here. This is showing how beef production and consumption really varies a lot by region. So the reds are showing consumption levels, beef and lamb per person across different regions. You can see people eat very little beef and lamb across much of Africa and Asia, while they consume relatively a lot in Europe and the Americas. Looking out to the year 2050, the change is in that yellow there. That's where we're showing that 88% increase under businesses as usual. So we ran a scenario looking at, well, what if ruminant meat consumption in the higher consuming countries declined to about 50 calories a day? And what's 50 calories a day? It works out to about 1.5 burgers per person per week. That's about half of current US levels. It's about 25% below current levels in Europe. But you can see that dotted line, it's still well above the national average for much of Asia and Africa. And if that was the only shift in diets that happened and people shifted towards plant proteins instead, that alone would nearly eliminate the need for additional agricultural expansion and additional deforestation, even in a world with 10 billion people by 2050. And as Janet mentioned, diets are already shifting away from beef in a lot of places, right? It's a lot of people don't know that per capita beef consumption has actually fallen by 1/3 in the US since the 1970s. And now we're seeing a lot of things like plant-based burgers coming to the market that are designed to appeal to meat lovers. We're seeing restaurants serve more blended beef mushroom burgers that are juicier and taste just as good as 100% beef burgers. So these types of plant-based or plant-forward dishes are competing with the conventional meat products on really important consumer attributes like taste and price and convenience. So, and of course, some people are also shifting towards plant-based foods for health reasons, right? They want to eat more fruits and vegetables, more legumes, more whole grains, and less red meat for health reasons. So this is the last question, which is a hairy question. Would eating less beef be bad for jobs in the food and agriculture sector? And the answer is, well, not necessarily. You know, some people can think, okay, well, we just talked about what if beef consumption falls by half in the US, but that doesn't necessarily mean that production or jobs would fall by half in the US. Because remember, if we go back to that, this graph, there's going to be a lot of growth in beef demand across the developing world. I mean, look at those areas in yellow across those, 7 billion people by 2050, projected to eat quite a bit more beef than today. So overall, it's an 88% growth under business as usual. Our scenario here that reduces consumption to the dotted line, that still leads to a 32% growth overall in global beef consumption between 2010 and 2050. It's just kind of bending the growth curve downward. So as a historical example, right, total beef, so per capita beef consumption has declined in the US by 1/3, but total beef production in the US has held steady since the 1970s. So essentially the same amount of beef is going to feed an additional 120 million Americans. We're stretching a scarce resource further. And so since we can probably count on demand in emerging markets in China growing, this will lead to more export opportunities over time, although building such markets obviously does take time. In addition, we're also seeing major meat companies like Tyson, Cargill, Maple Leaf Foods, Purdue starting to invest in this fast-growing alternative protein market. So it's interesting to see them positioning themselves not only as meat companies, but more broadly as protein companies. And they're doing this even as, of course, they're working to reduce emissions from beef production in their supply chains through the types of improved production practices that I mentioned before. So just a few takeaways, and I'll turn it back over to Janet. But right, one, beef is more resource intensive than most other foods. Two, it does have a substantial impact on the climate. Three, dietary choices do make a difference, especially when you account for land use and effects on deforestation or avoided deforestation. And then finally, boosting productivity and reducing beef production emissions is also critical especially again across the tropics where yields are relatively low and where future meat demand growth is projected to be the fastest.
Wow, so a lot of facts there, but it's kind of refreshing to have some evidence-based facts there, particularly in this sort of climate of misinformation sometimes. I have to say that every time I hear Rich, I always learn something new, so thanks for that, Rich. So I just want to underscore again, at the heart of solving the climate problem is fixing the energy system. We talk a lot about the energy system that propels the economy and all the need for renewable energy. That is important, but we don't put enough attention on the other energy system, which is the one that propels people. So I'm glad we're talking about this today. I said earlier that WRI is a mission-driven organization, so we're not satisfied with just doing research and analysis. We also want to use that to drive action. So we think of ourselves as a think and a do tank. So I just wanted to mention briefly 2 initiatives that we're working on to actually help shift the diets and increase the share of plant-based protein in diets. So we're not about turning everyone into vegans or vegetarians for that matter. The first one is the Better Buying Lab. It's launched in 2016, and its goals really are to research, test, and scale new strategies and plans that help consumers select more sustainable food. And like all WRI's initiatives, it's a partnership with many organizations, including Google, Hilton, Sodexo, Korn, Stanford, and others. Just 3 examples of the kind of things that they're working on. One, talking about how the food industry communicates about plant-based diets. So things about how do we present more plant-based diet, selections on menus. How you do that can significantly influence how much orders they get from people reading them. Popularizing dishes rich in plants on typical menus that you see in fast food and other outlets. So it isn't just the vegetable wrap that's your only choice. And then just lastly, thinking about how you connect shifts towards more plant-based diets in food services to actually climate goals, which actually brings me to the second initiative that I wanted to mention, which is the cool food pledge. It's an outgrowth of the Better Buying Lab. But here we're working with facilities such as hospitals, schools, and workplaces to help them cut their greenhouse gas emissions. And the goal is by 25% by 2030. And we're going to be announcing a cool food pledge at the UN Climate Summit in September. So we hope you'll join us there. So those are 2 of the initiatives that we got underway. The broader Creating a Sustainable Food Future report is much more, though, than shifting diets. We actually offer 22 solutions on the production and consumption side, but today we're focusing on one of those, which is shifting diets. So I think it's about time to hear from you. So we'd like to start taking questions now.
Thanks, Janet and Rich. So just a reminder that you can find more about this topic at our blog on bit.ly, it's bit.ly/beef and climate change. So we'll now open it up to your questions, and you can ask a question by typing it into the chat box. We'll take as many as we can until we get to the end of the hour. And of course, you're also welcome to follow up with us over email. So let's just pause for a quick second and look at some of the questions that are coming in. And our first one is, could you possibly comment on impacts on reduction of dairy products?
Sure. So would it be possible, Jillian, to go back to the slide that had, it was after question 2.
Different food.
Yeah, the relative impacts of different food types. So yeah, so I mean, keep going back. Yes. Yep. So perfect. So the interesting thing here is, so dairy products overall, whether you measure it per calorie or per gram of protein, are kind of on par with things like pork and poultry, fish and eggs, and are quite a bit less greenhouse gas intensive than the ruminant meats. So that's one thing, is that, I mean, shifting from beef or lamb towards other things is going to deliver more of a land and climate benefit than shifting from dairy to other things. That said, it's the, after ruminant meats, it's the next most greenhouse gas intensive. One thing that we found was actually interesting when we started looking at actual diets is that vegetarian diets, people tend to, obviously cut back completely on meat, but they tend to replace a lot of that meat, quite a bit of that meat anyway, with dairy. And so we thought that was just kind of interesting, looking at the impacts of vegetarian diets, and that there's actually quite a bit of difference between vegetarian diets and then vegan diets, because the vegetarian diets still include a lot of dairy and eggs do have still significant greenhouse gas emissions and land impact.
Next question: why is wheat and corn less intensive than beans and lentils are?
I mean, on the graph there, they're actually all pretty close together, and it kind of depends how you slice the data. You can look at greenhouse gas emissions. This is per unit of protein. You can look at it per calorie. You could look at it per pound or per kilogram. But as a general rule, all of the plant-based proteins, all the plant-based foods, since you're directly eating the plants, are going to be more efficient than the animal-based foods, because the animals first have to eat the plants. And then of the animal-based foods, it's the ruminant meats that are the most land and greenhouse gas intensive.
Think of the animals as a sort of middleman. They reduce the efficiency because you now have the food going through two systems.
Next question: can you quickly explain changing land use again?
So, I mean, I think the way to explain the concept that we're trying to get across here is that global land use is changing, right? Agriculture is continuing to expand into tropical forests as the global population rises, and as diets shift, as incomes grow, diets shift towards these more resource-intensive foods as people become more available more able to afford them. And so, in places like the U.S. or Europe, where we consume a relatively high amount of resource-intensive foods, shifting back in the other direction, again towards plants, basically opens up more planetary space to feed more people while reducing pressure on forests, while trying to avoid future deforestation. And then ideally, while actually opening up some current agricultural lands that could be reforested. We found that if the ag and land sector were to play its sort of fair share in holding greenhouse gas emissions below 1.5 degrees, which is the really ambitious target, the world's going to need to reforest vast amounts of agricultural land. Some is like nearly 600 million hectares. So the amount of ruminant meats that we consume, and also the way that we produce the ruminant meats, actually is a pretty big variable in how much land is demanded by agriculture and how much reforestation ultimately is possible.
Next question. Are you looking at land use change emissions for feed in North America, e.g. converting prairie grasslands for soy and corn?
Yeah, I mean, our analysis is more focused at the global level, because we are aware that those switches between those different land types are occurring in North America. But it's more, we're looking at the impacts of what would happen if you see like big population-wide consumption changes in these different foods, and what's likely to happen. The biggest impact at the global level is going to be more or less tropical deforestation kind of at the margin.
So maybe I could just also sort of jump in here. I mean, as I mentioned earlier, global beef consumption is going to rise 88% between now and 2050. I said half of the vegetated planet is already being used to produce food, and that's about all there is. We can't keep driving the agricultural expansion into the remaining forests. So to accommodate that 88% increase in beef consumption, we have to increase productivity on existing lands, which we absolutely need to do. But we also need to reduce demand in high consuming countries, so that some of those people that don't eat very much now can eat a lot more. So that's a challenge. There's just a finite amount of land that we can use for food production. We're using it all right now, and allowing more expansion of the agricultural footprint into forests is going to contribute to climate change problems. But it's also going to affect our ability to produce food, because food production relies on a variety of ecosystem services that forests provide.
Thank you. We have a lot of questions coming in. Next one, what would you say in response to those that say personal diet shifts have little impact on the industry or market as a whole?
Oh, that's an interesting point. We're not necessarily in the business of saying if we give people perfect information about what they're, about diet shifts, what types of food are better for health, what types of food are better for the planet, that's going to move the needle. We know that information and education alone isn't necessarily going to do it, and we need to see sort of broader shifts. So that's why, Janet mentioned the Better Buying Lab, the Cool Food Pledge. We're interested in sort of this systemic change, and that requires those businesses, other organizations that provide a lot of food to help sort of alter the choices and make more delicious plant-rich choices available. So it's not just about saying this is what's good for the climate and having lots of people shift for environmental reasons, but if more of the plant-rich dishes can kind of are as tasty, are affordable, and so on, it increases the likelihood that more people will gravitate towards them.
Let me just answer that slightly different, in a different way. It's easy to sort of think, well, even if I reduce my beef consumption, it's not going to make a big difference in the grand scheme of things. But actually, that's a mistake to think like that. This is a sort of collective action problem. We can all collectively do our best, and it does add up. And the food industry does respond to these kind of trends. We've kind of seen it in the past. So I think, yes, we're going to solve the climate problem and the environment problem by lots and lots of individual small actions. There aren't any kind of giant silver bullets out there, I'm afraid.
So this is related. Our next question is, since a vegan diet is by far the most effective diet for climate change and for health in millions of animals, why would it not be encouraged, or at least that WRI could consider creating some graphics showing the impact of vegan diets versus other diets?
I'm going to let Rich have a go at this after me, but I'm just to say it's not necessary to achieve a sustainable food picture, as our modeling has shown. I think also it's just practically it's going to be impossible to persuade everyone to become a vegan. And the fact of the matter is they don't need to become vegans. They just need to sort of, as Rich said, maybe get down to 1.5 beef burgers a week. So nice for those who want to do it, but not necessary for those who don't.
Yeah, I mean, I would say the same thing. I mean, one thing that we tried to do in our report was steer clear of scenarios that were kind of magic asterisks, right? If the world needs to sustainably feed 10 billion people, sure, if all 10 billion people became vegan, or if we completely eliminated food waste, or if every farmer in the world became as efficient and productive as the most efficient farmer today, then yeah, I mean, we could solve these big issues and more. But that's probably not going to happen. I think in the U.S., something like 5 to 6% of the population is vegetarian, half of whom are vegan, and so perhaps population-wide, you could have bigger absolute climate benefits by having the 95% of the population that does eat some meat, eat a bit less and eat more plants, and then especially since we're looking at these differential impacts of beef and lamb versus the others, it is the amount of beef in the diet is a big contributor.
I wouldn't want to personally live in a society that sort of legislated what I have to eat either. I do think we need guardrails and prices that reflect the real price of foods, but then give people choices.
Well, the other interesting thing about this sort of well, what if everyone went vegan? I mean, like I mentioned, a lot of the pasture land in the world, it can't grow crops. You can't put trees on it, so it is being put to to very good productive use to have cattle on those lands. And then there's things like the manure from the cattle then goes to fertilize the crop. So there's it was interesting in our modeling, if you at some level, if the meat consumption gets really low, the other parts of the system start to go haywire, because there's really important agricultural inputs that and ecosystem services that come from beef production.
Great, thank you both. So our next question is, many people suffer from nutritional deficiencies in developing countries where beef and other animal proteins can significantly help these people. How do you address this?
Could you please go to the answer of question 5? Because that's a very good point. We tried to be very clear in our any sort of the modeling that we did that this is about moderating consumption of resource-intensive foods in the highest consuming countries. So you can see that dotted line, which again is equivalent to about 1.5 burgers per person per week. I mean, look how far above it is where these 7 billion people are projected to be, their diet is projected to be in 2050. So this isn't about telling people in rural sub-Saharan Africa to eat less meat. This is about moderating consumption in higher consuming places so that there's room on the planet for them to eat more.
Can I just also follow up there, Rich, with, it's really important to be laser focused on this undernourishment issue, but it is also true that there are 2.5 times more overweight and obese people on this planet than undernourished. So 1 in 3 people are now overweight. So that also has a whole series of health and environmental consequences to it. So we need to look at that side as well.
Yeah, but I think the challenge obviously in developing countries is, a better, more varied diet, and in a lot of cases that's going to include more animal products than today.
And one of the ironies here of all this is that often those people that are undernourished in developing countries are actually working in the food system. So the very people that put food on our plate are often the same ones that go to bed hungry, which is another issue that we tackle in the Creating a Sustainable Food Future report.
Our next question is, can you speak to Mitloehner's calls that the emissions estimates for ruminants are overestimates because of how methane works in the system? How valid are these and how should that be interpreted?
Yeah, I mean, it's interesting. We've seen this, this sort of debate about methane over the past year or so. I mean, my understanding of it is that yes, methane breaks down in the atmosphere more quickly, much more quickly than CO2, right? So over, I think, 10 or 20 year period. But methane is also much more, it's a much more potent in the short term than CO2. And so, I mean, I think that there's arguments that if you look out over 100 years, 200 years, yeah, the methane breaks down. Now, here's a couple things to think about. One, while it's true in the U.S. that the herd size is declining and that cattle methane is declining, globally, the herd size is increasing and methane from ruminants is increasing. So, and that's causing a lot of warming right now, right in the near future. And then I would also bring it back to the land use piece too, that since beef production globally is increasing and encroaching into tropical forests, that releases CO2, and CO2 persists in the atmosphere for a long time.
Next question. Looking at the map of emissions intensity of beef production, there seem to be significant efficiency issues in sub-Saharan Africa and Latin America. Which strategies are expected to be most effective? Improved land management, better feed, or new cattle breeds?
All of the above, I think. I mean, it's obviously it's going to depend from place to place, and production systems do vary from place to place. But I mean, I think we tried to list sort of the common necessary ingredients for boosting production, and yeah, better breeds, better feeds, better veterinary care, and better management of the grazing systems themselves, and then and things like silvopastoralism too.
So there's a huge opportunity to improve productivity and at the same time reduce greenhouse gas emissions from beef and other livestock production in developing countries. And actually some of those same solutions will actually help provide more income to those farmers and workers who are part of this very large amount of undernourished people. But I will sort of say we have to do that. But even the most sort of efficiently produced beef is still going to be generally more greenhouse and gas intensive than your common plant-based proteins. So yes, we have to deal with the production one, but it doesn't mean that we don't need to now worry about diets. We have to do both.
And another interesting thing is there's this interesting synergy between improving productivity and also building resilience, because these livestock systems have to be resilient to a changing climate itself. So we talked a lot just now about emissions from livestock, but of course, climate change is going to have big impacts on the agriculture sector, and that includes livestock in developing countries.
Already seen some of that in the US, unfortunately, already with livestock.
All right, 2 questions. What about grass-fed beef? How does that fit in terms of GHG emissions? And then a second question, why is lamb land use so much more resource intensive than beef? Is it partly a function of there being more grass-fed lamb than there is beef and they need more room to graze?
Yeah, so there's the first question. Yeah, that's it. That's the grass finished beef is a really interesting question. And my understanding is, so because it's actually a bit counterintuitive to, but I think because finishing cattle on grass versus grain actually leads to slower animal growth and a lower slaughter weight, on grass finished systems in the US, if you compare them to feedlot finished, the land use and the production related emissions per pound of beef that's grass finished actually tends to be higher than that of grain finished beef. So there's an interesting paper that came out last year that looked at, well, what would happen if the entire US beef sector were to switch to entirely grass finished beef. And I think, I don't remember the exact numbers, but I think it was like needed 30% more land to produce the same amount of beef, which would then imply either more land use change elsewhere, or if we want to avoid that land use change elsewhere, then we would have to significantly reduce beef consumption to allow, for more room. So the second question on beef versus lamb, not exactly sure. Yeah, I'm not exactly sure why the difference between the two. I do know, I mean, there's a lot more beef globally produced than lamb and goat. So, but yeah, that would be something for us to look into.
It's one of my favorite factoids around, land and cattle and climate change is that, if cattle were to form a nation, and just imagine that, they would be the 3rd largest emitter behind China and the US. So it is a critical sector.
Our next question, the Lancet report that was published this year was quite controversial to some. This person's interested in what your opinion is on the report's findings, and do you agree with the recommendations?
So it's interesting. The Eat Lancet report came out in January. Our kind of big global report came out in December. There's some commonalities there. I mean, the 3 big levers for reducing emissions in the agriculture system, both in our report and in the Eat Lancet report, were boosting agricultural productivity, sustainable intensification, reducing food loss and waste. Both reports looked at a reduction of 50% compared to today, and then shifting diets. I think that the difference between the two, our report was a bit more bullish on how we could accelerate agricultural productivity. The Eat Lancet report, the diet that they recommended, and that came from sort of like a nutritional review, was a more a bigger shift than what you see on the screen right there. I think the thing to remember about all of this is nobody has a crystal ball. We're looking out to the year 2050. A lot can happen in 30 years, and the commonalities between the 2 reports is really about the direction of travel. We know what needs to happen. We need to keep improving agriculture and really accelerate agricultural improvements. We need to keep reducing food waste, and we need to shift diets in the way that we said. And then to the extent that you do any more of one, you can get by with doing a bit less of the other, but we're probably going to have to do all 3 if we're going to be able to hit stringent climate targets.
Thank you. Next question. What's the role of pasture intensification, not cattle confinement, to reduce deforestation and reduce carbon emissions from the cattle sector in Brazil and other Latin American countries?
Yeah, so that's actually what we were mostly implying in that when I was talking over that chart that showed the differences in emissions intensity. So we're not recommending that the entire world shifts to the US style feedlot systems, but it really is all about boosting productivity of livestock production on pasture. And again, those ingredients that we talked about seem to be the essential ingredients in doing so. And it is a really big opportunity to help meet growing meat demand while reducing pressure on forestry.
And again, I refer you back to the Creating a Sustainable Food Future. We have a number of menu items that speak specifically to this issue.
Is the 88% expected increase in beef consumption based on existing trends of overconsumption of protein? If everyone ate only the recommended amount of meat protein, would there be enough land available to satisfy the growing need?
That's a good question.
I don't think we calculated that way. It's a very interesting question, though.
It is. Well, and then different people have different recommended amounts. So our projections are based on a widely used 2012 projection by the UN Food and Agriculture Organization, and I think it was called Agricultural Outlook to 2050. Now, they projected it was not an 80-something% increase in beef, but it was more like a 60% increase in beef. And we adjusted that projection in a couple ways, because one, since that 2012 report came out, the median population estimate has been adjusted upward by the UN a few times. So back then, I think it was 9.1 billion people by 2050. Now the UN is projecting 9.8 billion people by 2050. So we adjusted upward for that additional population growth. And then we had also discovered that the 2012 FAO estimate actually had still pretty low levels of calories in certain parts of, I think, South Asia and India. And so we didn't think a proper business as usual, what would it take to feed everybody in 2050 estimate would still include large levels of hunger. And so in those regions, we adjusted overall calories up to sort of, recommended levels. And so those two upward adjustments is why our projection is higher than that widely used FAO projection. But I mean, there's so many, again, there's no crystal ball. So there's so many, I mean, we even kind of went back and forth like what constitutes, like, what should go into the baseline, how much agricultural improvement should we assume in the baseline, and so on.
I mean, it's a really great question. I really like the question because, as I mentioned earlier, the average male American is consuming twice as much protein as he needs to meet his dietary requirements, and that's not isolated for the US. The question is, how do we get people down on this? Particularly, because I think there's a sort of sense when we talk about reducing meat, it's, well, I'm not going to get my protein, I'm not going to get everything I need. And that's sort of underscored by perhaps some of the messaging in this country. I mean, there's like protein shakes, protein burgers, like everyone needs more protein. So I actually would like to see more discussion and debate about protein.
Okay. Next question, how does organic beef agriculture compare to traditional agriculture in terms of carbon footprint? Which should we be utilizing more of?
Yeah, I mean, I think the short answer there is that, I mean, I think it depends. I've seen some different life cycle analyses of the conventional versus organic beef. This kind of gets back to the conventional versus grass-fed. Like organic doesn't necessarily mean lower greenhouse gas emissions. It could be higher greenhouse gas emissions. And in any case, organic beef or conventional beef are going to be more greenhouse gas intensive than chicken, pork, beans, lentils,
Yeah, so the critical issue here is productivity. And if you can have the same or even better still, more productivity using organic farming methods, that's great because, you don't have the other things of pesticides and, artificial fertilizers running off into the water. But unfortunately, not all the evidence suggests that is the case for all organic farming methods. And then you have to, if you take a productivity hit, then you're going to require more land to provide that same amount of meat. And as we said, all the land that can be used is already being used. So if that drives more deforestation, you'd have to weigh that against any kind of local organic benefits.
We have a ton of questions coming in. Thank you all so much. You can continue to keep adding them into the chat box.
Sure.
We're going to try and take as many as we can. So our next question is, what's your opinion on highly processed vegan meat alternatives? How does the carbon footprint of these alternatives compare to livestock emissions?
So, I mean, it's interesting to see this. There's actually more and more data coming out on it. So, I mean, you can think of, the two prominent plant-based meat alternatives right now, the Impossible Burger and the Beyond Burger. And there's life cycle assessment data out there now. So I know the University of Michigan last year did a study looking at the Beyond Burger and I think Qantas did a study looking at the Impossible Burger, and in both cases, greenhouse gas emissions, despite the much higher level of processing, are a lot lower because, I mean, you'd have to go back to that graph in question 2, but those plant proteins and the plant-based ingredients just, there's so much less land and greenhouse gas intensive.
Yep.
And the interesting thing too is, so higher energy use to produce the food, but much smaller land footprint. So you see things like, I forget the exact numbers, but 60, 70, 80% cut in greenhouse gas emissions, but 90% more cut in land use. And again, when we factor in land use into the effects on climate, if you have a product that uses 1/10 of the land, then that means less pressure on forests, and that's a real climate benefit too.
Yeah. The Impossible Burger, I think, is based on soya roots and the Beyond Meat on pea, and going back to that visual that we had of different things. Those sources of plant-based protein score much higher in terms of their lower land and greenhouse gas footprint.
So our next question refers back to how, Janet, you concluded your earlier presentation saying that men in America eat, I think, twice as much protein as they should. So this next question is, do women also eat too much protein?
Yeah, so they eat more, not quite as much as male. If I remember the figure, I think it was about 1.7 times. I have to go back and check that, but it was lower than the double, or almost double. But yes, they are also on average over consuming protein.
Yeah, I forget the exact number, but I remember, I mean, this is from the US, the NHANES, the dietary survey.
Yeah.
I think men report eating more than 100 grams of protein a day, and meanwhile, USDA says you need 56 grams for a man and 46 for a woman. And so, yeah, so there's definitely, I mean, I think that the takeaway there is, like, even if you do eat less meat, you don't have to only replace it with lentils and such. You can eat more vegetables and whatnot. It doesn't have to be a one-to-one replacement. I mean, we don't see much protein deficiency here in the U.S. I mean, it's interesting when you look at countries then that if their overall protein consumption population-wide is at about those levels, now that means that there's a significant amount of the population that is consuming below the recommended level, and that's not good. But that's not really the situation here in the U.S.
Next question. What's the best way to explain these facts to consumers who are unaware of such effects on the land and the contribution of climate change?
So we hope that all of you today who are going to write all these great stories are going to be part of that exercise. I don't know. I think it's sort of trying, like we create this like nice handy protein shopping guide, which you can find online, that tells you, for the common foods what the per gram of protein, THG and land is. So I'd refer people back to that. I also sort of say though that I'm also a little bit skeptical that providing information to consumers about the impacts of different food is actually going to change their shopping and purchasing habits, because what we've learned in the Better Buying Lab, it's a sort of myriad of other variables, like how the food choice is described on the menu, or when you go to get the beef burgers from the frozen section, is the veggie burger in the same place? So it's more of some of those kind of factors, which is why we focus on that next. But we have not done any research looking at this specific issue of what resonates specifically with individuals, more in the consumption space, particularly the food services sector.
Yeah, I think that's right, because I mean, I think a lot of consumer surveys show that people say they care about the environment. When you could ask them, do you want to eat more sustainably? The majority of people will say yes. Well, at the end of the day, what's driving their purchasing choices are things like how the food tastes, the price of it, how convenient it is, do they think it's safe to eat, and so on. Those things will drive it even more than health concerns, and then the health concerns in turn are going to be more salient to the consumer than environmental concerns. So, I mean, I have heard some people at universities say sort of like the younger generation is more attuned to this link between what we eat and the impacts on the environment, and so maybe messages will work more for that generation. I'm not sure, but for the mainstream shopper, that it is pretty clear that it's the environmental benefit of the food that you eat is
I've
not the driving factor in what most people.
I've never seen anyone in the restaurant reading the US dietary guidelines before they order. Now, I'm not dissing those, because I actually think those guidelines are really kind of critically important to the food the food retail industry. They do pay attention to those things. So, but not the direct consumer for the most part.
All right, coming up to the end, we'll take a couple more questions. This next one is, do you have examples of sustainable cattle production initiatives that combine both increasing productivity and reduce land use carbon emissions?
Yeah, I mean, so I mentioned the example in Colombia of the silvopastoral systems, and I think there's a lot of that. There was another example in our report of dairy systems in Kenya who are using some of these similar innovations and cutting back on land use and cutting back on methane emissions. So I think there are more and more examples of this type of thing. And then I mean it's also important to note that here in the US or in Europe, I mean, thinking back to that map that I showed, beef production is quite efficient because we're doing a lot of these things already. So that's that's also something to that's important to note sort of in the global context, that in a lot of the places where we're consuming a lot of meat, it is being produced relatively efficiently.
But it is also true that that we're much more efficient in countries like the US. So actually, in addition to exporting beef, the US farmers should export their expertise in being some of the most efficient producers in the world.
This next question is, I think we've got just a couple minutes left, so this one is about putting some of this research into action. So are there any universities that are participating in the Better Buying Lab research by naming plant-based foods on campus in more appealing ways to increase purchases? And maybe you could talk broadly, not just about what universities are doing, but other research that's happening in the Better Buying Lab.
Sure. Well, I mean, universities are some of the leaders in this, I would say. In the Better Buying Lab, one of the members is Stanford University, and Stanford is part of this larger consortium called the Menus of Change University Research Collaborative, and they're all interested in how can we serve healthier, more delicious, and more sustainable food in our dining halls, and how can we link our dining operations to the expertise, to the faculty on campus. So there's really interesting stuff happening. So at Stanford, for example, in 2017, they came out with this study looking at, well, what happens if they name their vegetable side dishes in the dining halls with more appealing language. And so they tested out kind of basic boring language, they tested out sort of healthy language, and then they tested out indulgent language. So instead of just carrots, it's like twisted citrus glazed carrots. And they found a significant increase in student selection of these indulgently named items. I think it was an increase of between 25 and 41% over the sort of basic boring names, or even over the healthy names. So universities are kind of, in a lot of ways, kind of leading the ways, and then there's also businesses who are doing really innovative stuff as well.
So, Rich, you tried that on your children at home to get them to eat their vegetables? I'm going to try that.
Not easy.
All right, we'll take this just one last question, and then because we've gotten so many, we'll probably take a look through and see if we can turn some of these into maybe an FAQ blog or something. We will try and get some answers to you on these questions that we weren't able to get to today. So our last question, would it be more efficient to rely on restaurants and food markets to revise their offerings towards more climate-friendly options and influence consumer behavior, or vice versa, where consumers first shift their demands and the food industry responds accordingly?
So all of the above. Sorry, I know we keep saying that, and it must be really annoying, but we actually do need to work both sides of this, and they work in tandem. So great question to end on. Thanks for that question and for all the others. It's a real pleasure that so many people joined and were interested in this critical topic, because it gets so little attention, even though it's such a critical issue, as I said, for all 6 of the other global sustainability challenges that WI works on.
Okay. And with that, I'll just remind you that you can find some more information at bit.ly/beef and climate change. That's our blog. And Janet, Rich, do you have any parting thoughts for those still on the line?
Well, we are what we eat, and what we eat has a profound impact on our environment. So yeah, let's not all turn into vegans, but let's moderate. Those of us who consume a lot of meat, particularly ruminant meat, just let's try moderating it. Can we get down to that target of 1.5 or the equivalent of beef burgers a week?
And I would just close on saying, I mean, there's no silver bullets in this. The how to sustainably feed 10 billion people is an enormous challenge, and it's going to take innovations from the farm to the plate. And how beef is produced and consumed is such a big variable in, you know, whether we can sustainably feed 10 billion people or not. And so it's great to see innovation sort of across supply chains on this, and we'd love to see a lot more of it going forward.
Keep asking the great questions and keep writing about this.
Thank you to Janet Ranganathan, who is Vice President for Science and Research at WRI, and Rich Waite, who is a Research Associate with the Food Program. Reminder that this webinar has been recorded and we'll make it available on WRI's events page. We will try and get to your other questions probably in a blog format. And thank you very much to all of you for joining.